Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a book that asks a really fundamental question, one that challenges a core belief held by billions for, wow, almost 1,700 years.
So the book we're looking at, The Unbound Conscience, kicks things off with a pretty provocative question. It asks, is the doctrine of the Trinity something you have to believe to be a Christian?
And the book's answer? It's a surprising no. And the reason why, it claims, has nothing to do with those later church councils. Instead, the answer is hidden in a kind of forgotten world, the conceptual world of the first century. Okay, so to really get this, we're going to break it down into 4 parts. First, we'll tackle the whole question of dogma. Then, we'll meet this key figure, a forgotten philosopher. After that, we'll see how this totally changes how you might read the New Testament, which all leads up to the book's big finale, the difference between dogma and opinion. All right, first up, a question of dogma. The book basically starts by throwing down a challenge to a huge assumption. It asks, was the Trinity, the way we think about it today, actually taught by the apostles, like plainly? Okay, now this timeline, it's everything to the book's case. Just look at that massive gap. We're talking more than 200 years between when the apostles finished writing and the famous Council of Nicaea. That council, you might remember, was all about settling these huge, fierce debates and finally nailing down the Trinity. So this begs a really big question, right? What world, what ideas were floating around when the apostles were actually writing? Because it clearly wasn't the world of Nicaea. And that question leads us right to the book's star witness, the forgotten philosopher. The author basically says this guy is the most important voice in the whole debate, and yet most of us have probably never even heard his name.
So before we meet him, we've got to get our heads around this one key idea he worked with, the Logos. In Greek thought, the Logos was, it was the divine word. It was seen as this bridge, this go-between, connecting a God who was way out there, totally transcendent, with our physical world.
Okay, so the witness is Philo of Alexandria. He was a major Jewish philosopher, and here's the kicker. He lived at the exact same time as Jesus and the apostles. The book points to this quote where Philo calls the Logos the firstborn of God, through whom the Father made the universe. That language, it's pretty striking, right? Sounds familiar.
And it doesn't stop there. Philo also calls the Logos the image of God and the firstborn son of the uncreated Father. And this is where the book says we find the central puzzle, a being who is super divine, but also created. How does that work?
So in Philo's world, the Logos wears all these hats at once, right? Firstborn, image of God, the one who does the creating. He's even called a second God. But he's also called the most ancient of created things. It seems like a total contradiction. How can you be both?
Well, the book says Philo had an answer, and it all comes down to a really key distinction he made. He separated the idea of being divine from something called aseity. Aseity, that's a fancy word for being totally self-existent, not needing anything or anyone to exist. That, Philo said, belongs only to the one supreme God, the Father. So the Logos? He can be divine, totally sharing God's nature, but he doesn't have aseity because he comes from the Father.
And that idea brings us to part 3, reading with new eyes. The whole point the book is making is this. What if we read the New Testament through this Philonic lens, using the ideas the apostles would have known, instead of the lens from Nicaea hundreds of years later? Well, it argues, the texts start to look completely different.
Let's take a super famous verse, John 1:1, and the Word was God. Okay, the book zooms in on this tiny but apparently critical detail in the original Greek. See, when the text talks about God the Father, it uses the phrase ho theos. That means the God, with that little word the. But when it describes the Word, it just says theos, no the. The book argues that through a Philonic lens, that's a huge difference. It doesn't mean the Word was the God, but that the Word was divine, like divine in his nature or quality.
And the book's case is that this isn't just a one-off thing in John's Gospel. It's all over the place. You look at Paul's letters, like Colossians and Corinthians, or the book of Hebrews, and they're using the exact same words as Philo. Things like image of the invisible God and firstborn of all creation, all while keeping this really clear line between the one God, the Father, and the one Lord, Jesus Christ.
So here's the big claim of the book. The apostles weren't trying to invent some brand new, super complex theology about a three-in-one God. They were doing something much simpler. They were making an identification. They were basically saying, hey, you know that Logos figure we all know about, God's divine agent who created everything? Well, he became a man. His name is Jesus.
Okay, so all of this leads us to the book's final, and maybe its most controversial, section, Dogma versus Opinion. This is where we get the book's final say on what the Trinity really is.
Now, to make its point, the book first has to be really clear on its terms. What's a dogma? Well, it's not just something you believe. It's a binding requirement. It's presented as a truth straight from God that you absolutely must believe to be a Christian.
And then it contrasts that with a word you probably don't hear every day, a theologumenon. What's that? It's basically a theological opinion. Now, it could be a really smart, well-argued opinion that lots of people have held for a long time, but, and this is the key, it's understood to be a human conclusion, not something God directly revealed. It's something you can discuss, debate, and it's not supposed to be binding on your conscience.
And this is where it all comes together. The book's central conclusion is that the doctrine of the Trinity was fundamentally miscategorized. It argues that it started as a powerful philogumenon, a theological opinion, which was, centuries later, elevated to the status of a non-negotiable, binding dogma.
So why would they make such a huge claim? Well, the book lays out three main reasons. First, that key word from the Nicene Creed, homoousios, which means of the same substance. That's a philosophical term you just won't find in the Bible. Second, you can't separate the doctrine's history from politics. It was hammered out at councils called by Roman emperors. And third, it argues that the original, simple confession of faith for the apostles was just, Jesus is Lord. That's a long way from the complex formula of Nicaea. And all of this brings us to the book's final, ultimate point. Really, it's an argument for the freedom of conscience. The author claims that a believer's conscience should only be bound by what the apostles originally taught and should be free from formulas that were added on later, after the apostles were gone.
So, we've walked through this book's pretty challenging case, right? All the way from a forgotten philosopher to the nitty-gritty of Greek grammar. And in the end, it leaves us with a pretty deep question to think about for ourselves. Where exactly does our theology end, and where does our faith truly begin?